The samurai, paragon of honor, bound by an unbreakable code. The public face of war, whose duels were a matter of legend. The ninja, master of shadows, a specter of the night. The unseen hand of conflict, whose methods were shrouded in mystery and fear. For centuries, our imagination has pitted them against each other in a timeless battle of light versus shadow, honor versus deception. They are the ultimate archetypes of feudal Japan. But was this legendary rivalry real? Were they truly mortal enemies, locked in an eternal struggle? Or is the truth buried deeper, beneath layers of myth, propaganda, and Hollywood fiction? Today, we draw back the curtain of history to separate fact from folklore. We will uncover the complex, surprising, and often contradictory relationship between these two iconic warriors. The answer to whether they were enemies or allies is not as simple as you think. To understand the samurai, we must first understand the world that forged them. Japan, for centuries, was a land defined by conflict. From this crucible of war arose a military nobility, a class of professional warriors who would come to rule the nation for nearly 700 years. They were the buk, the military houses, but history would know them by another name, samurai. The word samurai literally means those who serve. Their origins trace back to the Heian period, around the 8th century, as provincial warriors hired by wealthy landowners to protect their domains. Over time, their power grew. They amassed land, influence, and martial prowess, eventually eclipsing the authority of the imperial court itself, and establishing the first shogunate, a military dictatorship, in the 12th century. The samurai were no longer just servants. They were the undisputed masters of Japan. To be a samurai was to be more than just a soldier. It was to live by a rigid, philosophical code that governed every aspect of one's life and death. This was Bushido, the way of the warrior. While the code wasn't formally written down until much later, its principles were the bedrock of the samurai identity. At its heart were several key tenets. Chugi, Zhongyi, absolute loyalty to one's lord, or daimyo. A samurai's life was not his own. It belonged to his master. To betray this trust was the ultimate disgrace. Then there was meiyo, honor. A samurai's reputation and the honor of his name were paramount. He was expected to conduct himself with dignity, integrity, and sincerity at all times. This obsession with honor dictated how they fought. Battles were often preceded by formal announcements of lineage and deeds. Combat was ideally a series of one-on-one duels between worthy opponents, fought openly on the battlefield. To strike an enemy from behind or use trickery was considered cowardly and dishonorable. Courage, or yuki, was not merely the absence of fear, but the ability to act calmly and decisively in the face of death. A samurai was expected to enter battle with a tranquil heart, accepting mortality as an ever-present companion. This philosophy was embodied in their iconic war gear. The armor, the yoroi, was not just protection. It was a work of art, intricately woven from silk, leather, and lacquered iron plates, often bearing the crest of their clan. It was a symbol of their status and identity. And then there was the sword, the katana. It was more than a weapon. It was, quite literally, the soul of the samurai. Forged with meticulous, ritualistic care, its curved blade was a marvel of engineering, capable of cutting through armor with terrifying efficiency. A samurai carried two swords, the long katana and the shorter wakizashi, a pairing known as the daisho. This was the exclusive privilege and symbol of their class. To lose one's daisho was to lose one's honor. The samurai was the sun, the brilliant, visible, and honorable symbol of power in feudal Japan. But every sun casts a shadow, and in the shadows, another kind of warrior was being forged. Forget what you've seen in movies. Forget the black pajamas, the mystical powers of disappearing, and the armies of masked assassins. The Hollywood ninja is a caricature. The historical reality is far more subtle and infinitely more fascinating. First, the name. While ninja is popular today, in their time they were more commonly known as shinobi, one who conceals himself, or one who endures. And they were not a distinct social class in the way the samurai were. Shinobi were specialists, drawn from all walks of life. Farmers, priests, merchants, and, yes, even disenfranchised or lower-ranking samurai who found their skills for sale. They were intelligence operatives and special forces, not a legion of black-clad clones. Their origins are murky, likely emerging from the clandestine tactics used by mountain ascetics and warriors resisting the central government as early as the 12th century. But they truly came into their own during the chaotic Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period, when Japan was fractured by constant civil war. The art they practiced was ninjutsu, and contrary to popular belief, its primary purpose was not assassination. Assassination was a high-risk last resort. The true value of a shinobi lay in information. Their core disciplines were espionage, reconnaissance, and sabotage. A daimyo needed to know his enemy's troop numbers, supply lines, castle layouts, and political alliances. Sending a samurai army to find out was like using a hammer to perform surgery. Sending a shinobi, however, was a different matter entirely. Infiltration was their specialty. They were masters of disguise, or hensojutsu, able to pose as priests, merchants, entertainers, or farmers to move through enemy territory without suspicion. They mastered psychological warfare, spreading rumors and disinformation to sow chaos and distrust within an enemy's ranks. They were saboteurs, capable of starting fires in enemy camps, poisoning wells, or destroying food supplies to weaken an army before a battle even began. Their tools were not mystical, but brutally pragmatic extensions of their skills. The iconic shuriken, or throwing star, was not a primary killing weapon. It was a distraction, a tool for harassment, or used to create an opening for escape. The kunai, often depicted as a dagger, was primarily a multi-purpose utility tool, like a python or a pry bar. Smoke bombs, metsubushi, were used to blind opponents and cover a retreat. Grappling hooks and rope allowed them to scale castle walls, and caltrops, tetsubishi, could cripple pursuing soldiers. Their legendary black pajamas, the shinobi shozoku, were likely not pure black, which stands out at night, but rather dark navy blue, brown, or gray to better blend with the shadows. And they were often just the simple, functional clothing of a common laborer, easily shed or altered for a disguise. The shinobi was a pragmatist. Their creed was success. Their battlefield was the mind of the enemy. Their theater of operations was the darkness, the space between what was seen and what was known. Here, we arrive at the heart of the perceived conflict. The samurai and the shinobi were not just different types of warriors. They were living embodiments of two fundamentally opposing philosophies of warfare. Bushido was a philosophy of the sun. It championed directness, honor, and public glory. A samurai sought to win on the open battlefield, to face his enemy eye to eye. His name and his actions were his legacy. The ideal death was in glorious combat, serving his lord. Deception, ambush, and assassination were antithetical to this code. To a purist samurai, Such tactics were the tools of cowards and low-born thugs, a stain upon the honor of war itself. Ninjutsu, conversely, was a philosophy of the shadow. It was entirely pragmatic, stripped of all ceremony and pretense. The goal was victory, achieved by the most efficient means possible, regardless of how it looked. Why face a superior swordsman in a duel when you could poison his drink the night before? Why lay siege to a castle for months when one man could slip over the walls and open the gates from within? The Shinobi understood that war wasn't won by honor alone. It was won with intelligence, misdirection, and the exploitation of weakness. Glory was irrelevant. Success was everything. Anonymity was their shield. A successful shinobi was one whose name was never known, whose actions were never discovered, attributed instead to bad luck, ghosts, or betrayal. Because of this, the samurai establishment, the ruling class, publicly held shinobi and their methods in contempt. They were a necessary evil, at best. To openly admit to using shinobi would be to admit that the honorable path of Bushido was not always enough to secure power. It was a contradiction that the samurai class could not afford to acknowledge. This public disdain created the illusion of a natural, ingrained enmity. But this wasn't a battle between good and evil. It was a clash between idealism and pragmatism. In the brutal, unforgiving landscape of feudal Japan, both were essential for survival. The samurai provided the force of arms and the political legitimacy of honorable conduct. The shinobi provided the intelligence and the unconventional tactics that could turn the tide of a war before the first sword was even drawn. One was the mailed fist, the other, the unseen dagger, and a wise lord knew he needed both. The 15th and 16th centuries saw Japan descend into over 100 years of relentless civil war. This was the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states. Daimyo, the great feudal lords, carved up the country, each vying for ultimate control. In this era of constant betrayal and shifting alliances, survival depended on having every possible advantage. And the most powerful lords were pragmatists. They understood that the honorable code of Bushido, while essential for morale and discipline, had its limits. This is where the line between enemy and ally begins to blur. Because while a daimyo would never publicly praise the work of a shinobi, he would absolutely and frequently employ them in secret. Shinobi clans, particularly those from the mountainous regions of Iga and Koga, became legendary for their skills. They weren't a rogue force, but highly organized communities that operated essentially as independent mercenary agencies, offering their unique services to the highest bidder. A daimyo would dispatch a trusted samurai retainer to make contact, negotiate a contract, and relay orders for a specific mission. Infiltrate a rival's castle, gather intelligence on troop movements, or create a diversion. Many of the most famous daimyo of the era are known to have used shinobi. The brilliant tactician Takeda Shingen and his rival, the god of war, Uesugi Kenshin, both employed networks of spies and agents to gain an edge over one another. But there is no greater example of this symbiotic relationship than the story of the man who would ultimately unify Japan, Tokugawa Ieyasu. In 1582, Ieyasu was a guest of the powerful warlord Oda Nobunaga, when Nobunaga was betrayed and forced to commit seppuku in Kyoto. Ieyasu was suddenly trapped, deep in enemy territory, with only a small retinue of samurai bodyguards. His enemies were closing in, and his death seemed certain. It was at this desperate moment that a man named Hattori Hanzo stepped forward. Hanzo was a samurai of Iga descent in service to Tokugawa, and he had deep connections to the local shinobi clans. He proposed a dangerous, unconventional plan. Instead of trying to fight their way out, they would sneak through the mountains of Iga, guided by the local shinobi, who knew the terrain like the back of their hand. What followed was a harrowing journey. Guided by the Iga ninja, Tokugawa Ieyasu and his men traveled through secret mountain passes, through forests, and over rivers, completely evading the armies searching for them. The shinobi acted as scouts, bodyguards, and guides, using their knowledge and network to ensure the future shogun's safe passage. Ieyasu made it back to his home province, a journey that would have been impossible without the aid of the shinobi. This single event changed the course of Japanese history. Ieyasu never forgot the debt he owed. When he finally became shogun and unified Japan, he brought Hattori Hanzo and many of the Iga ninja into his direct service. He employed them as an official security force, guarding the inner gates of Edo Castle, his new capital. They became his spies and his secret police, a clandestine organ of the new Tokugawa state. In this context, were they enemies? Absolutely not. They were indispensable assets. The samurai lord, Tokugawa Ieyasu, was the master. The shinobi, led by the samurai Hattori Hanzo, were his loyal, specialized servants. They were not allies in a modern sense of equals, but rather a tool employed by a master craftsman for a task that required finesse, not force. The sun had found a way to command the shadows. But the story is not that simple. For every daimyo who employed the shinobi as a valuable tool, there was another who saw them as a threat to be eradicated. A lord's hired agent is another lord's mortal enemy. And because shinobi from Iga and Koga would work for various masters, a samurai from the Takeda clan might find himself fighting alongside a shinobi one year, and defending a fortress from that same shinobi the next. In this sense, they were frequently and undeniably enemies on the battlefield. Nowhere is this hostility more apparent than in the brutal campaigns of the first great unifier, Oda Nobunaga. Nobunaga was a visionary, a brilliant general, and utterly ruthless. His goal was Tenka Fubu, to rule the entire realm by force. He had no patience for anyone who would not bend the knee. The independent, semi-autonomous shinobi confederacies of Iga and Koga, nestled in their mountain strongholds and selling their services to his enemies, were a thorn in his side. He saw them not as a tool to be used, but as a nest of vipers to be destroyed. In 1579, Nobunaga's own son launched an ill-fated invasion of Iga province. The Iga shinobi, using their mastery of the terrain and guerrilla tactics, humiliated the larger Oda army, sending them into a full retreat. This was an insult Nobunaga could not tolerate. 2 years later, in 1581, he returned for revenge. This was the Tensho Iga War. Nobunaga amassed a colossal army, estimated at over 40,000 men, and invaded Iga from 6 different directions. He wasn't there to conquer, he was there to exterminate. The shinobi of Iga fought back with everything they had. They used their knowledge of the land to wage a desperate guerrilla war. But they were hopelessly outnumbered. Nobunaga's samurai armies systematically surrounded their forts, burned their villages, and slaughtered anyone they found, warrior and civilian alike. It was a campaign of total war. The historical records speak of immense destruction and loss of life. Iga province was left a smoldering ruin. The independent power of the Iga shinobi was shattered. In this conflict, there is no ambiguity. Oda Nobunaga's samurai were the hunters. The Iga shinobi were the hunted. They were mortal enemies, fighting for their very survival against a warlord who saw their way of life as a direct challenge to his absolute authority. And even on a smaller scale, they were adversaries. Imagine a samurai guard tasked with protecting his lord's life. His greatest fear would be the silent blade in the night, the poison in the cup, the whisper in the dark. His enemy wasn't the armored warrior at the gates, but the shinobi infiltrator who could already be inside. In every castle, in every camp, samurai were tasked with defending against the very techniques the shinobi had perfected. In these countless, unrecorded moments of silent tension and sudden violence, they were locked in a deadly dance of hunter and guardian, aggressor and defender. They were, without question, enemies. So, were they enemies or allies? The truth, as is often the case in history, is not a simple choice between one or the other. The answer is both and neither. The relationship between the samurai and the shinobi was not one of ingrained cultural hatred or deep-seated friendship. It was a relationship of pure, cold pragmatism, dictated by the shifting needs of power. They were not defined species of warrior, but roles to be played in the grand, bloody theater of feudal Japanese warfare. A shinobi could be a samurai lord's most valuable asset one day, and the target of his army the next. They were two sides of the same coin, two halves of the art of war. The samurai was the public face, the symbol of strength, honor, and legitimacy. The shinobi was the secret hand, the instrument of espionage, sabotage, and the harsh realities that honorable warfare could not address. The legends paint a picture of black and white, of light versus dark. But history is rarely written in absolutes. It's written in shades of gray, in the complex motivations of men who used whatever tools they could to survive. The samurai and the shinobi were not eternal enemies. They were a reflection of the duality of war itself, the celebrated glory, and the silent, unseen cost of victory. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the hidden truths of Japanese history, please show your support by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and hitting the notification bell. Let us know in the comments what piece of Japanese history you want us to uncover next.